All right, everyone, welcome to the session Ally at ASU Beyond Compliance. If you are joining us online, please place your questions in the Q&A panel rather than the chat panel, as chat will not be moderated. For attendees here in the room, please hold your questions until the end of the session. We will try to get to as many as possible, but if we don't get to them, some presenters will join the chat and try to answer questions individually. Our next presenter, Dana Randall, is an award-winning creative director, product designer, and digital accessibility expert with a 25-plus year career driven by her passion for creating digital experiences that are not only beautiful, but inclusive. In this interactive presentation, we'll learn how to turn accessibility into a competitive advantage for ASU and explore the strategic benefits of accessibility. Please join me in welcoming Dana Randall.
Thank you so much. So today we'll talk about accessibility beyond compliance. I know the accessibility conversation often tends to be very compliance focused, but today I'm hoping to approach this conversation from a slightly different lens. So a little bit on sort of the format or the outline for what I'll be sharing today. I'm going to talk a little bit about my personal journey and then around some topics ranging from admissions, housing and accommodations, classes, and a couple key takeaways. So I have to admit that when I was first approached to do this talk, I have to be a little honest that I was a bit hesitant. And the reason for this is not because I don't do a lot of public speaking, because I do several presentations like this every week, but my education story and background is not something that I personally have felt pride in. In fact, I would say that for most of my life, it has been a huge source of insecurity. So I will be honest as well to say that I exercise the art of procrastination building this presentation, often because of some of this insecurity. But I did notice something when visiting the ASU website that stood out to me, which said ASU, an inclusive academic powerhouse. And today I really want to talk about how to take disability inclusion to the next level, and not only to attract the most brilliant minds, but also ensure their continued success. As mentioned, my name's Dana Randall. I'm the head of accessible user interface design at Level Access. So to start, my college journey was very far from typical. On the screen, I have an image of a pair of pointe shoes. I actually entered college as a fine arts major in dance at OSU via an audition process at the age of 17. At 19, I dropped out. I attempted a return to college and then I left again. And then after 4 years, I returned to a small art school for a degree in web design and programming. You see, despite growing up in the gifted and talented programs in school, that's what they called it back then, I was a terrible student. My grades were mediocre at best. I did not thrive in school, but my issue was not intelligence. I actually scored off the charts for most standardized testing, but I was really never able to find my place or my stride in school. This explains why when I did go to college, my family supported me going after my passion, dance, the one place where I felt like I belonged, and I was really good at it. You see, my mother was a doctor and my father went to law school. And here I am, the total disappointment, lacing up my pointe shoes and putting on my tutu. Now, if I only knew then what I know now, I might have had an entirely different experience in my education. You see, at 40, I learned that I had been living with a disability my entire life. I just had no idea. You see, not all disabilities are visible or apparent. On the screen, I've got a graphic. It says some disabilities look like this, and it shows a person with limb differences using crutches, someone who's using a guide dog, a wheelchair user, but then it says some look like this, and it's just like an outline of a kind of standard person. And, for me, that's definitely something that I identify with. I recognize that I do not present as a person with disabilities. If you met me in passing, you would not know that I live with disabilities, and this is, I I'd say I identify as disabled. I identify as a zebra. We'll talk more about that in a minute. I am neurospicy. If you're familiar with that term, it's a playful version of living with neurodiversity. And by career, I'm a creative director. You see, when I was growing up, autism and neurodiversity in girls was not a thing. I learned when I was around 40 that how I was experiencing the world was not typical. And so many of my struggles in school and work and socially finally made sense. And I had answers that I didn't even know I was looking for. Learning that my brain just works differently suddenly connected so many dots for me. I also live with a genetic condition, hence the zebra identification. I live with a genetic connective tissue condition that impacts me physically. It's called Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, and it's the hypermobile type. Well, that definitely makes sense why dance and ballet was my strength, because hypermobility was a strength, but now it's something that is a bit more of a weakness for me. Once it became clear that dance wasn't my long-term path, I shifted to another special interest, still equally creative and artistic, design. You see, my brain is exceptionally well-tuned for this type of work. I see colors with more vibrancy than most. I can detect patterns with ease, and I can convey feeling through few words using things like textures, lighting, sounds, smells, and visuals. There are things that I can do really well, but there are other things that I really struggle with. So with that, some of my strengths come with other weaknesses. Now, when we talk about disability, we often think about it by associating it with an ability that someone doesn't have. So for example, vision, meaning they're blind or low vision, hearing, like deaf or hard of hearing, some mobility things like limb differences or paralysis. And when we think about cognitive, we often think about learning deficiencies or speech related, like non-speaking or non-verbal. And these are totally valid. These are areas that require consideration and attention. And I will get into some specifics on those and how you can support those needs in a moment. However, some disabilities experience more, not less. And this is a couple examples of how my disability results in a hypersensory experience. So through vision, I do use glasses. So I would say in some ways I do have a visual disability, but I also have extreme sensitivity to bright colors and lights. Through hearing, I have something called hyperacusis, meaning that I hear sounds, I'm more sensitive to sound than the average person. Through mobility, I have challenges with hypermobility, joint dislocation, and chronic pain. And then from a cognitive side, I'd say I deal with not a learning disability, but more overload and overwhelm. And through speech, I kind of joke saying, I don't know when to zip it. I certainly don't have a lack of speaking. So today I want to talk about, opening your mind to understand that some disabilities sort of introduce the opposite. I think we often think about disability as things people like limitations. And yes, of course, there are limitations that I experience, but keeping in mind that disability doesn't always mean like without. Sometimes it can be like with more of. So in my world, I experience more, and this can definitely be for me equally as challenging. So now I'm going to jump into a couple specific areas through like the college journey that I can speak to firsthand, and some aspects of the student experience where disability can present challenges. So let's start with, the application process. Like, what if your application process didn't fully support screen readers, wasn't keyboard accessible, or student recruitment videos didn't have captions? This would exclude potential students or send a signal that the school isn't fully ready to accommodate them. Now, to be clear, I'm not saying that these are specific issues with your application process within your university, but rather my point is reinforcing how running into those blockers can make how they can make a person feel, right? But in parallel to that, I want to talk a little bit about like my experience where applications and anything, it doesn't necessarily have to be your application into the university, but into any sort of programs. I mean, even enrolling in classes quarterly. So my experience is overwhelm and confusion. Additionally, I have a vestibular disability. So for me, videos that are meant to get me excited actually trigger vertigo and vestibular episodes. And then also for me, speaking verbally with someone can feel very stressful. So I like to have a communication with a non-speaking option. So whether that's email or chat, you know, there are certain times, it's called selective mutism, where it's just like my brain is on overload. So my ability to articulate clearly and succinctly can be lost. That's when I kind of said my speech, I don't know when to zip it. You see, today in my presentation, I've got my speaker's notes, I've got my on-screen notes, and I'm like well buttoned up and prepared. But often when I'm in a experience of cognitive overload and overwhelm, I think about, you know, my ability to interview, answer questions succinctly, and it can be a bit of a nightmare. So, you know, around this, it's like understanding the power of knowing your needs have been anticipated is really a fantastic way to kick off a relationship. You know, it might seem minor in some ways, but when so much of your life is faced with obstacles around every corner, you really notice when someone has clearly made the effort to consider your needs without having to ask. It can be the start of a really meaningful relationship. So it's not as much about having to scream from the rooftops, like, we do all these things in accessibility. But trust me, as a person living with disabilities, when you're not constantly running into these blockers and these barriers, you notice. And you really form a bond and a connection with the organization or institution where it's very clear someone thought about what you need in order to be successful. So now I want to switch kind of themes a bit to something like more physical, more real world housing and accommodations. So what if your house didn't feel like home? There are many accommodations for physical disabilities, and these have been pretty well defined over the years, but non-apparent and cognitive disabilities can be under-recognized. So I ask, like, what if your accommodation request is not standard? Look, for me, I think housing and accommodations was actually one of my biggest hidden problems during my college experience. As a person on the spectrum, having the ability to recharge effectively is critical to my ability to succeed. Now, I didn't even know or understand this when I was a student, because remember, I wasn't diagnosed until I was many, many years out of college. But reflecting back, I do identify that this was the root cause of some of my failures in school. You see things like living with roommates, fluorescent lighting, visual clutter, like represented here in this, what I guess is meant to be a dorm room photo with lots of stuff on the walls. Also just general like constant commotion and activity, and even things like still having to socialize once home. These were all major blockers to my ability to reload and recharge. And so the question I ask is like, do you have a process or a safe space for students that might be experiencing these challenges? Like, these are very different kind of challenges than, you know, a wheelchair accessible entrance. Okay, super important, but I want to just call attention to how underserved and underrepresented non-apparent and cognitive disabilities are. And now I'm going to shift a little bit to the topic of classes. So, you know, I actually was able to be in a little bit of the last session where I was really kind of happy to see this theme reflected, but we all learn and process information differently. Now, on the screen, I have a picture of, it says system error codes. It's a black screen with like green error text, and then it says system error codes in red. Doesn't actually meet minimum contrast. It says, so I'm thinking, like, if all classes, systems, content, and activities, first of all, should be functional with assistive technology. That's not something that I need and I run into. But that's very, very important. Imagine how frustrating it would be if every turn you encountered system errors. At what point would your frustration become too much? And then again, flexible options for participating in classes are really valuable. And that can be important for people with physical disabilities, non-apparent disabilities. And also, I want to note that as a person with disabilities, my needs fluctuate from day to day. So my need for accommodations may be different on Monday than they are on Wednesday. If I'm in an experience of overload, and overwhelm and sensory overwhelm, I might need to participate in something virtually where I can control my environment. And then on Wednesday, I might be recharged and I might be open to being more in an in-person environment. So flexible options for participating in classes can be really valuable. And then also ensuring that there is a place for students to report issues and there's a process to address them. So like, imagine if every time, if I was mentioning like you running into constant system errors, imagine if every time you reported these errors to your boss, they weren't fixed. The occasional incident, I think we all expect, but if it's constant, and that can become really demotivating. And so also in the theme of classes, I want to shout out to my science class. Honorable mention for hands-on learning options. You know, I remember I told you that I went to art school, but my fondest memory of any class was, of all things, science. And the reason why is I really credit the professor for knowing his audience. It was an unlikely bunch of art and design students who weren't going to be engaged or passionate about science. But this class took a different approach. There were no lectures. Everything was interactive, conducting experiments, building and creating. We were learning by doing, and that is exactly how my brain thrives. When I'm in the format of a lecture hall and someone is just speaking, it's a bit like that teacher in Charlie Brown, I think it is, who's just like, wah, 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 wah. I can't even understand the words that they're saying. And it's not because I can't hear them. It's just my brain will tune it out. When I'm sitting in those environments, what's happening, just to really kind of open up and explain, is like, for me, it comes across as just a series of sounds that mean nothing. Because what's happening while I'm sitting in this, lecture hall environment is I'm noticing every movement of the students around me. There might be a flickering light in the corner that's distracting me. Maybe someone's wearing a perfume or a cologne that's a little bit strong smelling for me. And so what's happening is, because I live in a hypersensory experience, I'm receiving all this information at once that are totally unrelated to the lecture that's happening in the class. And therefore, I'm just not able to process the actual content of the lecture. So, the option for hands-on learning gave me a way to learn the same concepts through physical touch. And now, knowing what I know now, that makes perfect sense to me. Not only like, why did I genuinely enjoy my science class? And also, those were my best grades. But it's important to recognize the diversity in learning and comprehension. We talk about technology often in accessibility, but we must equally pay attention to the cognitive impact and requirements of the content and the methods. Someone struggling with cognitive load or sensory overload is no indication of their intelligence or lack of intelligence or their ability to succeed. Living with neurodiversity is living in a world that is not designed for your brain, much like how living with physical disabilities the experience in living in physical spaces that are not designed for your access needs. And also, I want to note that if the technology is accessible, but the content or the class requirements are not, the class is not truly accessible. So I'll leave you with a couple key takeaways. And if you only retain 3 points from today's presentation, let it be these 3 things. First of all, accessible and inclusive design benefits individuals with disabilities, but also improves the overall UX and UI for all users. Also, not all disabilities are known or present. And designing for usability versus compliance. I think it's always a good filter. If you think about the functionality and usability, there's a high probability that you're also going to meet compliance guidelines. And so I really want to reinforce that, like, leading from that perspective will set you up for success when it comes to things like compliance. And last, but definitely not least, is that cognitive disabilities and the impact of digital experiences is often not emphasized or fully understood. And that this is also likely the largest demographic of your student body. You know, women with neurodiversity is still grossly underdiagnosed. And I could do a whole talk just on that, but I really just want to reinforce that, you know, hopefully the topics of, you know, non-apparent and cognitive disability has sort of opened your mind to things. Of course, we want to think about those with physical and apparent disabilities, but we also want to be equally thoughtful about those with non-apparent disabilities. Thank you very much. I'm going to stop sharing my screen if I can figure out how to. Stop share.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dana. That
You're
was
welcome.
fantastic. Are there any questions in the room while we have a few minutes with Dana? Any questions in the room? Yes, let me run the microphone back to you so Dana can hear.
It's a little bit more of a personal question, but just as someone who was diagnosed and, you know, you had a disability so much later in life, what did you find helpful, or like how did you kind of navigate identifying as disabled, or like seeing what you might have thought was just your personality or something like that as your disability?
That's a great question. So I absolutely did not identify as disabled. In fact, even when I was diagnosed with neurodiversity, I still actually didn't identify as disabled. I kind of felt like a fraud, to be honest with you. I actually only first identified as a person with this disability when I got a condition called Ramsay-Hunt syndrome. So I actually did have a parent physical disability where I had left side facial paralysis, and I looked like something was different with me. And at that point, I became more comfortable personally with like the language of I'm a person with disabilities. And then once I sort of broke through that, even though my facial paralysis did resolve itself, I do have some kind of long-term effects from that. That was for me what made me kind of more comfortable and more open with that sort of self-identification. Even though I knew I didn't feel like I could use that language. I would say that that should not be the case. But for me, that was my personal journey. It took time. It took time for me to become comfortable with it. And I think also the work that I do at Level Access and working in the accessibility industry has also made me feel more comfortable being open. In fact, in the first probably year or two of my work, I never spoke about neurodiversity. I only spoke about Ramsay-Hunt. It took time for me to personally feel comfortable with that sort of self-designation. So I think it's everyone in their own time. And also sometimes it's okay if you don't want to like identify that way.
Great. Thank you so much for that response, Dana. And thank you for that question. So we will begin transitioning into our next session, which in this room will be putting digital accessibility into practice from WCAG compliance to AI and innovation in just a few moments. So please feel free to join us here in the Ventana room at Tempe MU or virtually on Zoom. Thank you, everyone. And thank you again, Dana.
Thank you.